And this is part one of a two-part series. I'm going to do SharePoint Designer, what's new in SharePoint Designer part 2 tomorrow afternoon. And in that second session, I will be concentrating on workflow. So what's new in workflow with SharePoint Designer. So in this session, I hope to deal with things that are everything but workflow, okay? You may have seen much of SharePoint Designer already in many of the other sessions. It has been completely redesigned, and it is as much a developer's tool as an information worker's tool. In fact, on the Microsoft certification, there's going to be some new certifications out with SharePoint 2010. Then the developers will be expected to learn and use SharePoint Designer and will be tested on it during the certification. But it's a whole range of people can use this, and what I'm concentrating on this session is what you can do without code, all right? I have a great passion about using SharePoint with out of the box, using the browser, using SharePoint Designer. So I'm like the information workers to make the best use of SharePoint, and it's very rich. It's even richer now than in the previous version. So you can do a lot more before you actually get the developers in, or you have to buy a third-party tool. So do spend time learning about SharePoint 2010 before you spend your money, okay? The demos I'm doing on today, of course, are not on RTM. RTM was released to manufacturing. SharePoint 2010 was released on Friday, late on Friday. At some time, it will be released to the web, so that you, if you're an MSDN subscriber or a TechNet subscriber, you'll be able to download it later on, perhaps next week, perhaps this week. We're still unsure from Microsoft exactly when it's going to be released. So all I can do is show you what I've learnt so far on the copy that I've been able to. And so when the RTM comes out, we'll see what remains there or whatever. So, who uses SharePoint Designer 2007? Yay! Whose organisations don't want you to use SharePoint Designer? So, my name is, oh, sorry, that was a big bang. My name is Penny Coventry. I'm an MVP on SharePoint Server. There's my Twitter and email. I'm an independent consultant, so I don't belong to any organisation. I've had numerous jobs along the way. I've been a team leader of a 300,000 implementation of SharePoint, and I'm currently authoring the next set of books on SharePoint 2010. So 3 chapters on the admin companion, and I'm doing the SharePoint Foundation, which is the new name for WSS, step by step, and SharePoint Designer, step by step. So that's a little bit about myself. So here's the agenda for this session. So I'm going to have a look at SharePoint Designer, when you should use it, who you should use it. I'm going to have a look at something called the Business Connectivity Services. Now, who went to Brett Longsdale or Nick Swan's session? So there might be a little repetition there. What's so great about Business Connectivity Service, that used to be called the Business Data Catalog in SharePoint 2007, and you were only able to use that particular feature if you had the Enterprise edition of SharePoint Server. With SharePoint 2010, the BDC, or the Business Connectivity Service, as it's now called, is now available from the free version of SharePoint. So how many of you will only be installing SharePoint Foundation? All right, so everybody's SharePoint Server then. Okay, because it's one or the other. Or both, I suppose you could. So perhaps this is not a big deal. How many people use the BDC in SharePoint 2007? Okay, you really need to start using it. It's really great. It's even easier now. I'm going to talk about themes because people believed that SharePoint Designer was only about branding. That was not true for SharePoint Designer 2007. It's not true for SharePoint Designer 2010. But what they've introduced is a new theme infrastructure. So it will be easier for information workers to change the colour of their sites. So I'll show you about that. It's nothing really to do with SharePoint Designer, just like the old themes was nothing to do with SharePoint Designer. You couldn't really amend them with SharePoint Designer, but I thought I'd just tell you about that because it is new. Then I'm going to talk about custom actions. Now, this is nothing to do with workflow custom actions. Right? This is the capability of adding links on your ribbon and adding links on the drop-down. And we'll go back into SharePoint Designer. I'll mention some best practices along the way. So what is SharePoint Designer? Yes, just like SharePoint Designer 2007, it's based on front page, but it's had a redesign, this version, right? So it looks even different than before, okay? They've put an awful lot of time and effort and money into this product. So hopefully it won't crash as much. Yes, the performance is much better. In fact, some of the things you can now do in SharePoint Designer, it's a lot faster doing them in SharePoint Designer than using the browser. So in the previous version, I often told people, use the browser whenever you can and then flip into SharePoint Designer for the stuff that you can't. Okay? Well, now there's certain things that, yeah, if you want to, do them in SharePoint Designer. Okay. So we've got a load of things that we can, it's been designed to help you. It's still free, okay? So you will still be able to download it off of the Microsoft site. You may have seen the 6 pillars of SharePoint 2010. Microsoft have divided up the functionality that's added in SharePoint 2010 into these 6 pillars. Well, SharePoint Designer fits into that composite pillar. This is where you're building solutions, right? They're calling them composites now. So we're rapidly going to develop solutions. So SharePoint Designer is not a branding tool. You can do some branding, but its main purpose is to build solutions. Okay? So it's not meant for somebody who's just a contributor of a site. It's most probably going to be used by business analysts, people who are site owners or site collection owners who actually want to develop a solution to meet a business need. Okay? So just like the previous version, if you have no experience of SharePoint using the browser, you don't use SharePoint Designer until you do know how to use SharePoint through the browser. So what are the improvements? As I say, it's the preferred tool, whether you're an information worker or a developer. The developer will most likely use it as a rapid application tool. And you as business analysts or site owners or whatever, you again could rapidly develop a solution. And then when you do find holes in the SharePoint 2010 functionality, then you can say, right, yes, I definitely do need a developer for that bit. Now, it's not compatible with SharePoint 2007 or Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 sites. You cannot open the previous version of SharePoint with SharePoint 2010. Okay? If you do need to support both your old environment as well as your new environment, you need to install side by side SharePoint Designer 2007 with SharePoint Designer 2010. Now, SharePoint Designer 2007 only came as a 32-bit product. So if you are doing side by side, you need to install the 32-bit version of SharePoint Designer. Okay? In fact, you must never miss a match 32-bit Office applications with 64-bit. In fact, I would recommend that you only ever install the 32-bit versions anyway. The only reason I see that you need to go with 64-bit is if you've got an enormous Excel spreadsheet. Okay? It's safer by going with the 32-bit. You cannot even open a single file with SharePoint Designer. You can't point to the C drive and say, please open this HTML or XML file. you can only open over HTTP or HTTPS SharePoint 2010 sites. Okay. It is no longer a web editing tool for the masses to get hold of a free, commercially product. So those people who sort of like download it because it's free, they'll not be able to amend non-SharePoint sites with it. Okay. Now, one of the biggest problems with SharePoint 2007 was, anybody guess? Pardon? Remember, this is being taped. There was some ghosting, yes? Okay. So as soon as you opened up a page in SharePoint Designer 2007 and you press save, you didn't even change anything on that site, and then what SharePoint used to do on SharePoint Designer's behalf is take that page, that home page, default.aspx, that was being linked to a file on the web front end in your site definitions, and take a copy of that and put it into your content databases. So you had broken the link to those files on the front end server. And that's why it's called ghosting, or Microsoft tried to introduce the new name for unghosting as customizing. And in SharePoint 2007, you used to get the little blue balloon with an eye in it, and that showed you had customized a page. You could always reset it back to your site definition. Now, SharePoint Designer understands about that. Okay? So when you first of all open SharePoint Designer 2010, you are going to be editing the page in safe mode. If you do want to customize the page and therefore break the link with the files on the web front end, you have to enter advanced mode. Okay? So you have to know what you're doing. So it's a lot safer tool, so you don't accidentally start customizing. So as I say, there's improvements in performance and stability. What else is new? Well, if you haven't seen SharePoint Designer yet, as so many of you may have, then we look like all the other Office 2010 products. So we've got the ribbon. Also, when you open up SharePoint Designer, you end up in something called the Backstage. Right? So there's sort of like two things. There's the Backstage and there's the Onstage, as people are calling it. And you flip between the two, you switch between the two by clicking the File tab. So we'll have a look at that. Once you are on stage, then you'll get the ribbon. You'll also got a navigation pane, so that replaces the folder task list. Here in the navigation pane, it focuses on the components that you expect to see on a SharePoint site. So it focuses on lists, libraries, workflows. You don't have to work out, where are the workflows? Where are the master pages? Okay. The navigation pane is all in SharePoint object terminology. Okay. There is the capability, if you want to have a look at the folder structure. So you can, if you want to, navigate to the _ catalogs folder and go and find the master page for yourself. Now, the main portion of the page, so we talked about the ribbon, we talked about the navigation part. Now, this main portion here can have different views depending on what you click upon. So if you click on lists and libraries, then the main portion is going to show you a gallery of the contents of the lists and libraries. So you then can click on the lists and libraries. If you click on the site itself, then you end up with a site settings page, so you can amend the description or whatever. And if you're actually clicking on a page and editing a page, then of course that main part of the page becomes an editing window. We've got a breadcrumb. Also new in this version of SharePoint 2010 is the ability to log on as somebody else. Okay? You don't have to right button click SharePoint Designer and say run as or anything. You've got the same sort of capability that you've got in the browser when you say sign on as a different user. And I'll show you that too. So what's been removed? Okay. Well, contributor settings, they are no more. Okay? So we're going to manage the permissions in a different way. So we're going to perhaps, what I should say is limit people's use of SharePoint Designer in a different way. We can, from a web app, on a web app by web app basis, we can specify that this particular web application, http://www.contoso.com, your internet site, nobody can use SharePoint Designer. However, on your intranet site, we could say, yes, these people are going to be able to use SharePoint Designer. And that's controlled through the central administration. You can also, on a site collection by site collection, restrict the use of SharePoint Designer. Other things are missing. There is a page on Microsoft's website that specifies what's going to disappear. A lot of it is because it's been left over from front page and what you would do on a non-SharePoint site. So a lot of it doesn't make any sense for a SharePoint site anyway. And because you can't open a single file, then of course you've not got the Microsoft script editor sort of thing. And you've not got the FTP capability. Also, you can't now export a SharePoint site using SharePoint Designer. Now, I used to find that really useful because I've got a website that's being hosted by an ISP, and of course I haven't got server access, and I know they're supposed to have their backup procedures, but every now and then I used to like to take a backup of my site. Well, I can't do that any longer. I'm going to have to rely on those ISPs to make sure that they are doing their operational procedures correctly. So let's get on and see what it all looks like. So the very first thing we're going to do is open up SharePoint Designer. And this is what is called the Backstage. And so because I've not opened a site before, just like when you open up Word, you'll see that, in Word you can say, right, what are my recent documents? And please let me choose one of those to open. So here we've got recent sites that I've already opened. If I want to open up a site that isn't specified in the recent site section, then I would click the Open Site button. I can also customize my site. Now, if you've already created a My Site, then you can click that button and it will open up your My Site. That would be you've said that is your preferred My Site. If you haven't created a My Site, then it will say you need to create a My Site. And if you've got a number of My Sites, then you need to say which is your preferred one before that button will work. In the recent sites, it will keep just 10 of your most recent sites that you want to open. You can also create a new site from this Backstage as well. So I'm going to open up one of my sites that I've recently opened. Who's developers in the room? Okay. Have you heard of the client object model? Okay. Now, SharePoint Designer is using the client object model as well as web services to talk and display information about the sites. Okay, just thought I'd throw that in. Right, so here we are. So we've got the navigation pane on the left-hand side. We've got the ribbon at the top. Now, this ribbon is context sensitive. So depending on what I click upon, that ribbon's going to change. So here is the site settings page, as I was talking about. And now I can amend, for example, the description of that site. It's also telling me information about the URL of that site and the version that that site is running. We've also got the total storage. So again, we know more information about this site on the page. We've got other information here. We can edit the site's homepage by clicking Edit Site Homepage link. And that will open up a new tab with that home page. You may notice that the SPF Team tab has got a little asterisk. Right? So those amendments that I've made to the description field have not gone live yet. It's not until I click the Save button that will that description go live. So here we have the home page. Now, there's a difference here from the previous version. We've got the... I closed the wrong one. Let's open up the home page again. Right. We've got the breadcrumb just above the page, and that's quite like the quick access bar that we had in SharePoint 2007. So we can actually see where we are. So we're in the editing mode for the home.aspx page within the site pages document library. So by default, every single page is going to be in a library. So this is very much like the publishing structure that you may be used to. This means we can version control our pages now. No longer will the page go live if we choose to do that, because that was again a problem with a team site. Also note that the first page, the landing page, if you just enter the URL of a site, before, in the previous version of SharePoint 2010, it used to go to a page called default.aspx. The landing page now is called home.aspx. This page we're also looking at is like a wiki page, okay? So that we can match our web parts in between our static text. Up here on the ribbon, we've got this ability to switch the page into advanced mode. At the moment, I'm in safe mode. So safe by default is the way that we're going with SharePoint Designer. So I can amend a page. So I could amend this page. Welcome. And we get the little dirty asterisk, just like in SharePoint 2007, saying that we've amended the page. So I can now save the page, again by using the little floppy disk icon. When was the last time anybody actually put their hand on a floppy disk? Sorry? So I'm going to click Save. So I'm going to save that. Now down here, you can see on the navigation bar, we've got all the artifacts, but underneath we can see that we're in the site pages document library, and underneath it I've got two files in the pages document library. If this was SharePoint 2007 and I click Save, I would have ended up with a blue circle by the side of home.aspx. I have not. Right? There is no blue circle. So I've not customized this page. Right? All I've done is amend the content portion of the page. So that's the portion that's been in the database. If I wanted to, so as you can see, I'm getting the no entry signal around certain parts of the page. But say I wanted to amend the title up here, I could click Advanced Mode. The page refreshes, and now I can amend this particular portion. So this is on a SharePoint Foundation site, but you can see that we've got the same sort of capabilities that we had on SharePoint Server publishing sites. Okay, so you might, if you've played around with publishing sites and the master pages and page layouts, then you'll be used to these sort of page holder types, which means that you can amend portions of the page that were originally defined in the master page. And now when I click Save, we get the same sort of dialog box that we got in SharePoint 2007. Are you sure? You are breaking the link to the files that are on the web front end. You are now going to customize this page. So we click Yes. Now we'll end up in the navigation pane with a little blue mark that's telling us that this particular page was a page defined in the site definition. It is no longer pointing to that file in the site definition. This is our own unique copy of that page. Now, the only thing is, once you click a page into advanced mode, there is no button, at least in this version that I've got, to say, please put me back into safe mode. I have to close SharePoint Designer and then reopen it again. And if I go back and edit the home page, the ribbon goes back to page editing, and then the advanced mode button now becomes active because I'm safe by default. So we've got all the capabilities of spelling and so on available to us. So I'm going to go back into the navigation pane, into the SPF team site. And we've got information here about permissions. So I can now, instead of going to the browser, I can say, please let this person, Erin perhaps, and I'm going to map her to a particular SharePoint group. Or I could map her directly to permission levels. I don't think it does, because there's not that option on there. Whereas on the browser, there is the capability of saying, yes, please do email this person or not. What we've got down at the bottom is the little icon right down here. Yeah, very hard to see it. There's a little button there that says, do you want to log on as somebody different? So I'm going to click that. Now I'm going to log myself on, or try to log myself on, as a person called Jack. Now Jack has not got any permissions at all on this particular site. So let's see what happens. Right, and I have typed it in right, honestly, which is the normal reason for getting this usually. But it will ask me 3 times. I'm hoping it should ask me for 3 times, and you know, I'm not allowed to do anything on this site because I have no permissions at all on that site. So the best thing is always to make sure you apply the correct permissions on your site, and that prevents users using SharePoint Designer. I'll show you the other ways in a minute. Let's close that and open it again. Whoops. This is beta. So this is before they did all the performance tuning and everything else, okay? Right. So what I'm going to do is now put Jack as a contributor. So I'm going to add Jack. And so I'm going to map him into the members group of this site. And the members group is mapped to the contribute permission level. So now this time I'll try and sign on with Jack. Right. Contributors cannot open this site with SharePoint Designer, right? So make sure you apply the correct permissions, and that's one way of stopping people using it. Now if I I need to close it down, it'd be quicker, and then start it again. And if I added Jack, and mapped him to full control, then he'd be able to open it. Now, I mentioned that there's another way of limiting usage of SharePoint Designer. You can do this at the site collection level. So let's have a look. So let's preview this site. So up opens the browser. And then at the site collection level, we've got something here called SharePoint Designer Settings. Now, I've got 4 options here. If I didn't want anybody in any of the sites to use SharePoint Designer, then I would clear that top level SharePoint Designer. At the moment, you can see by default, well, at least in this version, we'll have to see what happens in RTM, but these checkboxes are clear. So this means that nobody can amend files that were on the site definition. Now you might say, but Penny, you just did a demo where you amended a site that was defined in the site definition, the home.aspx page. That's because site collection administrators do not adhere by these rules. So again, don't give everybody site collection administrator permissions. Okay? But other people would not be able to detach home.aspx from the site definition file because that checkbox is saved. We can also decide which pages they can customize. So we could say, right, they can detach any page except for the master pages and the page layouts. Right? So we won't allow them to do that. Also, underneath the file structure, as I said, you could look at the file structure and you can find the underscore catalogs and you can see the hidden files that you don't usually see in the browser in SharePoint Designer. By clicking that last checkbox, you're saying that the person can't see those hidden files. They can only see the artifacts within the navigation pane. Now, we've got the same options at the site, the central administration page. Now, as with everything, there's always a couple ways round to get to this. So I'm going to just show you one way. So I'm going to say, right, I want to stop a particular web application from using SharePoint Designer. So I'm going to go this way to the web application. So I'm going to do Manage Web Applications. Then I can choose the web application that I want to alter. And as you can see, even in the central administration console, we have the ribbon. So I'm going to click the General Settings button. And down here, I've got SharePoint Designer. I've got the same 4 checkboxes, but instead of it being at the site collection level, it's at the web application level. So let's go back to the slide deck. Yeah. If you stop it at the web application, then you can't, even if you're a site collection owner, switch it back on. Okay. But yeah, site collection administrators, you know, they're demigods. You know, they're not server gods, but you know, therefore always make sure who you give your permissions to. Yeah, me. Right, so, yes, SharePoint Designer for information workers, for business analysts. Do things that you can't do in the browser. You know, you don't want to, the browser is very rich. Just because SharePoint Designer is targeted at information workers, doesn't mean that every information worker has to use SharePoint Designer. Okay. So use the right tool for the right thing. Yes, we've got the data view web part, data form web part, and the lists and libraries have got a new way of being displayed. In the old version of SharePoint, when you put a list or a library on a page, it created a web part called the list view web part. Okay. Now, the list view web part has been replaced by the XSLT list view web part. So, in fact, in the browser, when you put a list or a library on the page to display the contents of that page, you are, in fact, creating a form of the data view web part. Okay. And I'll show you that in the SharePoint Designer. Yes, it's meant for developers, it's meant for IT pros, but it's not meant for everyone. So you need to decide still how you're going to use SharePoint Designer as part of your governance, as part of your planning, right? You need to decide that and then decide whether you need to switch it off at the web application or on different site collections. If you're on an intranet, on a portal, you might stop SharePoint Designer on the top level site collection, but on all the site collections that are hanging off of the managed paths, you might allow that to be on. Okay? But that is up to you on your governance to decide that. So this is talking about if you have a number of environments, right? We were just talking about web apps and site collections within a web application. You need to, again, decide which of the environments, if you have got development environments and pre-production test environments or staging environments, again, which ones are you going to allow SharePoint Designer access to? So this is what I've already demoed to you. Right. So I've done a bit of the demo beforehand. So let's go back and let's amend that page again, and let's show you this new web part, this XSLT list view web part. So I'm going to place the cursor somewhere on the page, and I'm going to click the Insert tab, and we're going to add, it says Data View, but let me add the announcements list. And this is what would happen in the browser or in SharePoint Designer. It has added a web part, not the list view web part, which was using something called Camel to interrogate the back end and decide how to display the items from that list or library. It is now like a data view web part. Right? It is called an XSLT list part, but I've got all the same capabilities that I have had in the data view web part. So I could highlight a particular row, and I could say I want to apply some conditional formatting. And I could say, right, if the expires date is equal to the current date, I'm going to change the background to red. So some of these dialog boxes should look the same to you. Okay, so under the covers, it's not going to be too different from SharePoint Designer. It might just take you a little bit of a while to find certain things. And if I save that, I don't think that took, I think I'll just amend that again. Oops. Yeah. It lost that value somewhere along the way. So yes, it's highlighting something. And we've got the WYSIWYG view just as before, that when you apply something in SharePoint Designer, we can actually see that. We've got the capability as before to see the page either in design mode, or we can have it split mode so that we can see the code that's being generated underneath. or we could just see all the code itself. So exactly the same in SharePoint 2007. The code that it's generating is supposed to be much, much better, okay, than before. But I'll leave that up to you to quantify or not. So let's save that. So let's go back to the slide deck. So next we come to the Business Connectivity Service. As I say, it's an evolution from the Business Data Catalog. They have kept the acronym BDC. So you will see BDC still on the new version. However, it doesn't stand for the Business Data Catalog. It stands for the Business Data Connectivity. Okay. So if you did the BDC before, you used to have to develop something called an application definition file, which was an XML file that defined how you connected up to your external systems. And you could then display data from those external systems on pages within SharePoint. The data was not brought in SharePoint. All you were doing was connecting up to that back-end system, getting the data from that back-end system and displaying it on your page. Now, in the previous version, to display it on your page, you had a couple of options. There was about 6 BDC web parts that you could use to display the data from the back-end system. And there was also the ability to add a BDC column. So in your lists and libraries, you can actually take a copy of the information from those back-end systems for that particular column. In this version of SharePoint, yes, if you've got SharePoint Server, the Enterprise Edition, I believe, then you will still have those 6 web parts. If you're using the standard version or SharePoint Foundation, you've still got the capability of adding an external data column, but you've got the capability of displaying the information from the back-end system in what is known as an external list. It's a virtual list. It's a list that is almost like a pretend list. It's got nearly all the capabilities of an ordinary list or library, but the data is not being stored in SharePoint. You are still bringing it in over across the network. So I can see a lot better use of it. You will also use SharePoint Designer to create this BDC file, what they called the application definition file. In this version of SharePoint, they don't call it their application definition file, they call it the BDC model. BDC standing for Business Data Connectivity Model. Okay. So when would you use BCS? I'm sure Nick on his session talked about it. So simple projects. You can have intermediate projects. You can even get, if you've got SharePoint Server, you can even index your back-end system. If your back-end system is something like SAP or whatever, then you can also import the data into your user profiles. So you can have some information coming from Active Directory and some information coming from PeopleSoft or whatever. And then we could create external data and columns. So another new thing with the BCS is that not only can you use it within SharePoint, either as an external list or displaying it using one of these web parts, you can also use this BDC model file, and then you can use that within Access, Outlook or whatever, so that within Access or Outlook you can display the data from those external systems as well. Some of those Office applications are read-write, so when you display the data from the back-end systems, you could amend it in Outlook. Access only allows you read capabilities from those external systems. So why am I telling you all this? Well, as I said, you make the back-end system, you make this BDC model through the SharePoint Designer, and as a result of defining that data, So it might be like the employees list from a CRM system, or your customer list from one of your proprietary databases that you've built within your organization. Once you build that, it's called an external content type, because it's describing content somewhere else. Okay, external, and it's content type because you're describing the number of columns and the type of columns that external system has. And once you've defined it as an external content type, then you can use it in all these different means. So let's go for a demo. So let's get rid of that tab. So down here we've got external content types. So just like any other Microsoft product, the same thing is called different things in different ways. So external content types, you've got to think of business connectivity services. So it's now trying to retrieve information from the server to see if you have defined any external content types. So are there any BDC model files already uploaded for this particular BCS service? Everything now is a service application. So this particular site will be associated with a particular BCS service application. So tick, tick, tick. That's a very good question. When you define your model, so this is how you define your external content type, one of the things you have to say is go to that server, if it's like an SQL server, go to that database, right, and go to that particular table, and that's the information we want to actually display on our site. When you define all these things, you also have to specify the authentication mode that you want to use to get that external data. And there's several different types of authentication mode. One of them that is still available in this version is something called revert to self. In that particular authentication mode, you would be using the application pool ID to authenticate yourself with that external system. And then when you get the data, you revert back to the person's user ID who are signed onto that SharePoint site. You can also specify through the central administration website who, so if you've got that data using the application pool ID, then you can specify at the central administration console who could actually view that data as well. Okay. You can also say, I want to use like an Active Directory group or a user ID, in which case, because of the two-hop problem, you would normally configure something called the secure store service, which in the previous version used to be called the single sign-on. Okay? They've just changed the names. So yes, you need to think about that. And especially because if you're displaying data on a web page, and as I said, you can, in SharePoint Server, get SharePoint Server to index that back-end system. Well, the indexing process uses a different username than the name you would do if you were displaying information. If you bring up a search results page, then you usually see the title, and you usually see like a summary of some text. Okay? Well, that would be coming up using whatever user ID was set to crawl that index. So you, again, need to think about that as well. It's a big topic to think about. So let's go and create one. I don't know why I've not got anything coming up here. It should have come up with... Let's close that down again. We'll give it one more try. It should come up with a page that doesn't show any external content types, but allows you to click New Content Type, and then I could show you how to create a new content type. The models are stored in the, when you create a business data connectivity service, all right, when you create that using Central Administration Console or using PowerShell, you specify a database. And so the model files, when you upload them into that, then get stored within the data within that database. It's just like before, when you uploaded an application definition file, it went into a SSP database. Okay, so here it's still going to go into a database, but yeah, there's a BCS service. You associate service applications at the web app level, unless you're using multi-tenancy, in which case you can do it at the site collection level. But there must already be a business data connectivity service already created that this web application is associated with, and therefore when you create it here, it gets saved into the content database for that business connectivity service. All right, okay, lovely. So one of the buttons on the ribbon has become active. So here is a page. So I can now specify the name of this. So what I'm going to do is pull out data from the employees table from Northwind's database. Yes, who's used Northwind's database? Okay, well, we've gone back there again because it's such a good little database. So this is going to be employees. And now what I can do is, since it's employees, and especially if you're going to use this file that I'm going to create, perhaps import it into Outlook. And I want Outlook, when it's displaying this data, to know that it's like a contact list, right? So that it will realize that this is an email address, this is the person's telephone number or whatever. You can actually map it to a particular office type. Okay. And now I'm going to discover all my data sources. I've already connected up to this data source before. And here's all the tables from the Northwind's database. And so that's the table that I'm going to define how to get the data from. And I right button click and I can say create all operations. So underneath the covers, it's going to create one of these BDC model files, and it's going to say, this is how you get data if you're going to display it. This is how to get the data if you want to update it. This is how to get to the data if you want to create a new thing in the back-end system. So I'm going to create all operations. It takes you through a wizard. And what you do here, because we chose that it was a contacts type of data, I need to specify what this particular item is about. Right. So I can choose every one of these, and then I would map it to, so where's the full name? Oh yes, thank you. And so you'd have to go through each one of these and map it to the right thing. And so underneath the covers, it's building up this model for you. So you don't have to buy like a BDC man. I mean, BDC man is still got a place because this will only go so far. If you want some bells and whistles, then and so on. So once we've created that, so we're going to save that. So now it's actually taking that file and saving it into that BCS database. Now what I can do is I can go to the lists and libraries and I can create an external list. So I'm going to create an external list that will present the data from that back-end system. It's nearly got all the capabilities that an ordinary list has got, but of course there's certain things you can't do. So for example, like workflow, you might say, right, when an item has changed, I want to initiate a workflow? Well, of course, the system, the data is in the back-end system. SharePoint hasn't got the capabilities of adding triggers to the back-end system, so you can't add workflows to that. But you could, from this definition, include this external data source as an XSLT list view web part, and you can do all the formatting that you did in an ordinary list or library. Okay. So there it is as an external list. We could preview it in our browser. Oh, I must have done something wrong. Okay. Right, okay. Well, Nick's the man. But what we'll do is we'll go on to the next thing. So another couple of things I want to tell you about, right, is themes, as I've said. This is lightweight branding. This is nothing like the themes before. The themes before you had to put into the 12 Hive, and it was full of CSS files and GIF files and whatever. This is very much based on like the PowerPoint themes. In fact, you can use PowerPoint to create your themes. However, you can't do as much with themes as you could in SharePoint 2007. The themes here are only going to affect the colour and the fonts that you use. Anything more, then you're going to have to do the same sort of things that you did have to do in SharePoint 2007. So we can design something in SharePoint, in PowerPoint. We end up with a TMX file, and then we can import into the themes gallery and then allow people to choose that. You can alter the themes using the browser. However, that capability is only available in SharePoint Server. Okay. So I'll show you that as well. The next thing I want to show you are these custom actions, adding stuff to the browser ribbon and adding additional capabilities on the drop-down. So here is my site here, and I'm going to go to the announcements list. Let's go to the home page. So there's the announcements list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another option here. You know, perhaps I have created a page that is showing information from this list, and I also want to show on that page information from another list. You know, so if it was like a customer, then perhaps on the lower page I might want to show all the purchase orders open to that customer. So I can, using, you know, the same sort of things that you did with SharePoint Designer before. Or you could create your own workflow, and then on one of these links is that you would start the workflow that you've just created. I'm also going to change, so if I, for example, if I chose edit item, you end up with a new page. Here we've got a ribbon, so perhaps we want to add our own button to that ribbon. Okay. So I'm going to show you that in SharePoint Designer. So I'm going to go to the site. I'm going to go to the announcements list. Okay. And if I scroll down here, we've got a new section which is called Custom Actions. As I say, it's nothing to do with workflow actions. These are these actions I'm talking about either on the ribbon or as part of the drop-down. So if I click New here, this will add a link on the drop-down. So I could call it New Drop-Down Link. And as I said, I can decide what I want to display. I could display a page. Okay. So I'm going to just display this page. It's going to substitute item ID for the ID that I'm going to pick to show the drop-down list on. But I could create my own page. Or I could say initiate a workflow to do with a particular site. Or I could say navigate to a URL. So let's just choose this one. And there it is. It's been created. Let's refresh the browser. And then on the drop-down, I've got new drop-down list. I didn't have to do any saves. It went live straight away. Okay. Let's go back. Now, I've said that I can also add new buttons onto the ribbon. But when I click that new icon here, I was only able to add a link into the drop-down. If I want to add a new item on the ribbon itself, then I need to go up here on the SharePoint Designer ribbon and click Custom Action. And as you can see, I've got a number of places where I can create this custom action. Do I want it on the list item menu? Okay. Do I want it on the display form? So if I'm displaying the properties of a particular item, do I want it on that particular ribbon? Let's choose display form ribbon. So this is. And again, we can decide what is going to happen when I click that button on the ribbon. And I've got the same options. Now, I've also got some other options down here. If it's going to be on the ribbon, then of course, normally on the ribbon, we have an image to show people. Okay? Now, you can load up your own images in a document library, or you can have the ones from underscore layouts. Okay? So if there is one that's traditionally used for that type of action, then perhaps use the ones that are in underscore layouts. And then click OK. So if I now again go back to the browser and I want to display the items, there's the display form. All right, I didn't choose an icon, so that's why you're getting a red cross. Okay.
Any question on that? Could you, in that URL that's behind that button, could you pass in a parameter like some information about the item you're viewing?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you can file off into another application?
Yeah. Have you read the John Jensen's Building Applications Step-by-Step book? He does a lot of that, passing parameters to other pages, which will then take that value to decide what to display. Okay. All right. We've run out of time, so let me go through the best practices. If you want to stay afterwards, I don't think there's anything in this room. I will show you how to do themes, but as I say, it's not really SharePoint Designer orientated, but I will show you that if you want to stay. So, best practices. Let's start with the don'ts. Okay. Don't customize unless you have to. Okay. Don't ever touch any of the files that Microsoft provides you in the root directory. Okay, that's the 14 Hive. They're no longer going to call things 14 or 12 Hive. They're going to call them root directory. So that's exactly the same as in the current version, because they can get overwritten. Don't install SharePoint Designer on your server. You know, it's meant for you to be sitting at your ordinary desktop and then going over HTTP and HTTPS. The problem with installing on your server with SharePoint 2007 was that you would start opening up the files themselves from the 12 Hive, from the root directory, and SharePoint Designer used to corrupt them. Okay, and because they were being used by every single website, then of course you were causing all your websites to crash. There is a button when you display a page in the browser. There is a button saying Edit in SharePoint Designer. If you don't have SharePoint Designer installed on your server, then it will go over the internet and download SharePoint Designer. Okay? Don't do it at the moment because it'll download beta 2. Which won't work on the live version. Okay. But again, you might not like people to install software, so again, that's your group policy to stop people from installing it. That's another option. Don't develop a web part if there's one already out of the box. Right? Much better to spend your money to get the best return on it. Okay? We've got a lot more capability now. We can do a lot more things with the XSLT list view web part that you had to previously convert into a data view web part and then convert back and lose stuff. Don't customize when you can do it again out of the box. Don't build a master page when all you really need to do is tweak the CSS file. And don't edit the out-of-the-box CSS file. So yes, you've got core.css just the same as before. Right? Create your own CSS file and put your amendments in that CSS file. There are a lot more CSS files than before. So you have got a bit to learn. Do's, practice first, not on your production machine. Okay. If your site doesn't have a number of environments or you can't have the ability to have your own virtual machine, then ask your IT department to give you your own site collection to play around with. Okay? There's a lot more capabilities of exporting stuff now out of SharePoint Designer than there was before. So you can export master pages, you can export page layouts, and then your developers can take them and put them as a solution to then deploy throughout the whole of your farm. So it's a lot more better of reusing stuff, and we'll see that with workflows tomorrow. You can create workflows in SharePoint Designer and you can use them again on a different list or library and on a different site. Yes, you can still save a site as a template. It would save them in a template. You had to save the content, and then it would save the workflow. Okay. So practice first. If not, own site collection. If they won't give you your own site collection, do it only on one site. If they won't give you your own site, try it on a different page, not the production page. Make sure you always have a way back. That's a lot easier in SharePoint 2010 because the pages are now all in the a new document library. Here are some references of information. There's information about customizing and saving a theme. There's information about custom actions as well. So, hopefully you've enjoyed this brief whirlwind tour of SharePoint Designer, and be passionate about SharePoint Designer still. It's a wonderful product. Okay? Any questions? Please do ask. No, you'd have to take it out as a site template, list template. Okay. So there's the next thing to get excited about is the exhibition thing. Yes, at 6 o'clock. Yes, social, meal, food, drink. I don't know what's going to happen. It'll be as much a surprise to you as it will be me. Okay, hopefully I'll see you tomorrow.